steadfastcigars.com. Use promo code Covenant10 for 10% off your order.
heritagebooks.org, code Covenant10 at checkout.
All right, welcome back to Covenant Matters. I'm Josh Howard. I'm joined again by James and John. Guys, thanks for being with me on another episode. We want to mention at the front end, we still have a promo code going at Reformation Heritage Books. So if you were over at Reformation Heritage Books, which just got off of, I think, the biggest sale I've ever seen in my lifetime of some thick, meaty theological books, but they still have some good deals going over there, and you can get 10% off your order with the code Covenant10. That's Covenant10. So add that in your cart. Also encourage you to check out Steadfast Cigars, who is a longtime partner of our show and good friends over there at Steadfast Cigars. But today we're going to get together and have a little bit of discussion and dialogue regarding a recent article that Kevin DeYoung put out. I've finally got this pulled out, unlike the first time we started this podcast and I had to re-record. But we have it over at clearlyreformed.org, and the article is titled 6 Questions for Christian Nationalists. So as the time of this recording, we're recording this on the 3rd, and he released this on the 1st, so this is still a pretty new article. It's been out for 2 days. It's a meaty article, which one of the things that I do actually appreciate about Kevin DeYoung's writing, I know a lot of people will be like, oh, it's so long. I actually appreciate that he takes a lot of time to walk through these. It's not a short article, but it's a good, well thought through article that lays out his thoughts in a lot of depth. I appreciate that. I've seen at least one, I believe Doug Wilson, who was named in the article a few times, wrote a response piece. I don't think we're going to probably be engaging that, but anyway, that's out there, and I'm sure more we'll be discussing this article. But yeah, just any initial thoughts on this? Obviously, Kevin DeYoung, serving as moderator of the PCA, he's got a prominent spot teaching and also preaching within the PCA. The PCA is obviously under a time when we have a committee out studying Christian nationalism. And one of the things that I observed from General Assembly was a lot of people have very strong opinions on Christian nationalism. A lot of people were also refreshingly upfront with the fact that they don't know how to define Christian nationalism, or maybe how people within the movement would define it. So I think it's an interesting time, interesting topic. Any initial thoughts from you guys?
I think, this is not the first time that DeYoung's written on this topic, and at a number of points, one thing I appreciated is I felt like we got a better idea of his own view, because we've seen him. There's been times when I read his material, which has always been good, that I was like, I'm not sure where he lands, and I think we got a clearer picture this time, which was very useful.
Yeah, that was good. John, any thoughts on the article?
Yeah, I mean, anytime somebody speaks out into the ether of Christian nationalism, it gets a lot of traction. This one has really blown up the conversation again. So at least it's continuing on to raise refining points, I suppose, in some ways. But yeah, I'll share some more of my thoughts a little later.
No, for sure.
I really suggest writing a book and then having a big denominational discussion about it. Like if you can get that timing right, it's great.
Maybe found that book with a logical syllogism that nobody engages.
Doesn't hurt.
That would be tremendous.
Yeah.
We'll plug it. In fact, I'll plug it again.
Ooh.
James has a book out. My thing is blurring it out. There we go. King of Kings, out through Founders Press. There we go. And I do want to take a sidestep, by the way, and this might be inappropriate for the content of this episode. I really appreciate the guys at Founders Press. I've published through Founders Press before. In fact, I think it was a year and a half. It's not that long ago I published a book through Founders. Really appreciate them. They've caught a lot of heat for this book as well. And I just want to say those are good guys. They're on the Baptist side of things, so obviously they have some disagreements with the three of us here on this channel. But I've really appreciated those men over the years, and I think it's really tragic the way that some of their own camp treats them over things like this, where they're advancing what in my mind are some very basic foundational building block steps that that James was trying to put forth in that book. So tip of the cap to Founders Press. But we want to get into this article on 6 questions for Christian nationalists, which takes a little bit of a turn, I think, in the article. Some of the front end is a little bit different than the back end of the article. Kevin DeYoung gets into some of the kind of applications or specific questions for Presbyterians. But a lot of the discussion revolves around whether or not the magistrate should promote the true religion. Now, one of the things that Kevin notes in the article is that he's unsure of how to define Christian nationalism, which honestly I'm okay with. I don't think what and he starts off the article, by the way. I think this was kind of like part of the catch line, or the, this is like it's not
The hook.
clickbait, but yeah, the hook. Thank you. It's not clickbait, right? But like the hook was, he said, "I'm not a Christian nationalist, but I could be," and I kind of sympathize. I don't identify myself as a Christian nationalist.
Yeah, me
Some
neither.
people, yeah, some people that do identify with that, I find a lot in common with. Some I don't find much in common with. So I have some concerns and stuff like that. What's interesting to me, though, is a lot of the stuff coming out, for example, in this article, I don't identify most of what Kevin has presented here in this article as inherently Christian national. And I don't think, to be fair, I don't think he would necessarily say that either. In fact, he might clarify that within the article, and I might be forgetting. But in general, this is sort of talking about that general ether of what should the magistrate do within Protestant political theory. He's kind of toying around with the ideas of establishmentarianism and disestablishmentarianism. There's questions about the founding. There's questions about the Confession of Faith, and specifically the revision from 1788. A lot of these things are kind of working within this to advance what is a kind of pan-Protestant political thought, which I think Kevin is more so thinking toward Presbyterian thought, which I'm sympathetic to. All three of us are serving within Presbyterianism. But James, for example, your book was very, very pointedly just pointing out what a pan-Protestant political theory, or practical theory, would look like on that. So, anything I'm missing before we kind of jump into a little bit of the nuts and bolts of this?
Sounds good. Let's do it.
Okay. One of the things that I thought was interesting from the article was, the article is trying to engage the idea of, should the magistrate promote the true religion? Should he suppress false religions? To what extent should he? And to be fair, there's some good questions. I want to get to some of those questions later. I will say this at the front end. I think a lot of those questions, in fact, I think they're addressed as questions for Presbyterians. That comes a little bit later in the article. I think some of the questions put the cart before the horse, and that's a very I don't mean that as an unnecessary critique of the article nor its writer. I do think that happens within these conversations quite frequently. And this is what I mean. If you have the idea, for example, that the magistrate, just like every other creature on God's planet, in his role that God has given him, whether you view yourself as neo-Kuyperian or theonomic or whatever, that doesn't make a difference, I don't think, in this discussion. If your view is that the magistrate, as any other authority, any other principality or power, we could even say, anybody that exercises authority within God's cosmic structure and program, if your view is that all of those ought promote the true religion, then really that's the cart that has to become before the horse. The horse that then drags it is, well, how do we work that out then? What do we do in a society that has a lot of different religions and ethnic expressions? Yep. What do we do with this theory of religious freedom or religious diversity, or however you want to frame that, from the Constitution or from the founding? That's fine. Those are necessary discussions. However, biblically as Christians, ought we not come to a place where we can say every magistrate ought promote the true religion? Which, again, James, this is getting right at your book, right? So yep. I'm kind of expecting you to jump in at some point here.
I couldn't say it better myself. So
okay, well, I mean, you did, and you did so actually in like 100 pages, which was fantastic.
I think one funny thing, I did the math. I think Kevin's article is like 40% the size of my book, which tells you something about how long his article is, and also how I cheated on my first book and wrote an essay and got founders to put it in a hardback.
You wrote an essay with 432 blurbs at the front of it, like 432 endorsements. I got through 3 chapters of endorsements before I got to the book. It was fantastic. Okay, so no, let me look at this a little bit. So in the article talks a little bit about Samuel Miller, who celebrated God's blessings to America, talking about a land where the people under God are supreme and where we have no ecclesiastical establishments, which is an interesting way of framing it, because I think if you were to come at this and say, let's establish a Protestant political theology, or even a Christian political theology in whatever baseline, because again, I think we need to establish the cart before we start getting the horses that pull it along and talking about how far this is supposed to go. The arguments always go there within 5 minutes, and then we get lost in the weeds. But if you were to just look at things and say, okay, if God is supreme first, I kind of shuddered when I read that quote, because I don't quite like hearing a land where the people under God are supreme. That sounds very strange to me, because the people are often, according to Scripture, wicked and stupid. And I think that's just something as Christians that we can recognize. Like oftentimes we don't do these things very well. But if we were just to like take the first part of that at least, that the nation is under God, that means the entirety of the nation is under God, including the magistrate.
Sure.
So the magistrate ought not, for example, violate the first table of the law in public with the promotion of Christians doing so.
Hmm.
That would seem to me to be a very baseline thing, is that we as Christians should not want a political system in which the magistrate knowingly and repeatedly violates the law of God in public with our, not only with our acquiescence but our endorsement. That would seem to me to be a very baseline political agreement. He also asks in the article whether promotion, like how far promotion goes. Does promotion stretch to supporting churches and ministers from tax revenue? Does it carry over to making religious tests of office? He walks through a lot of ideas that he says are bad ideas in his estimation, which is fair. We could have some arguments about that. He said he might agree with promote, but the devil is in the details.
Hmm.
I felt like that was a pretty important part of the article, although it was couched in application, right? He's talking about application of whether you should have a state that has the jurisdiction to reform the church, which that's a pretty poignant example. But a lot of these are application based. However, at the end of it, he said, I might agree with promote. And that's the whole question is, the cart is, ought the magistrate promote the true religion? I worry that what the examples are doing is giving you one of the most overbearing, involved magistrate models we could envision. The magistrate coming into the church, rifling through our documents and saying, this doctrine is wrong, you need to redefine this. The cart would simply to affirm that the magistrate ought promote the true religion. Then you can say, however, that magistrate should have his hands largely off the church. We're going to have a very limited role for the magistrate. Government is going to be very small and truncated when it comes to affairs of the church. Like, all that would be fine, but that is the horse then that's driving the cart. The cart was never established as far as I could tell. And the cart, it seems he's a bit sympathetic to in the article, which is something I took as an encouragement from this article. The article seems to be sympathetic to the view that the magistrate, in some form or fashion, ought to promote the true religion. I think one of the major impediments to the article is that it doesn't like any way or any conception of how that is supposed to go about.
Oof. I didn't think about putting it that way. That's a good way to summarize some of my questions. Maybe the first note that I'd want to say is I think that this was a very conciliatory essay.
For sure.
When you look back at some of the other things he's written, it's this essay where he wants to say, here's what I agree with, here's what I would like to see, and note many things of agreement. You even saw him noting agreements with Wilson at certain points.
Yeah, I would point out, by the way, he quoted from Doug Wilson and from Dabney, and I suspect he did that on purpose, right? I think that was a little bit of a, hey, I'm gonna engage with some of these guys,
Yeah.
a little bit across the aisle from some of these issues.
Yep. Yep. The thing that I felt that I struggled with as I read the article was sometimes it was hard for me to tell whether or not he was opposing a particular action based on principle or prudence. So he would say, well, I don't agree with that. I don't think that's a good idea. And I couldn't tell if he's saying that is in principle not something that God designed government to be able to do, or if he was just saying, I actually think that might be counterproductive. That might, we might be shooting ourselves in the foot with that one. Sometimes it was clear. Sometimes it seemed as if he was saying he rejected it on principle in one place, but then on maybe no, it wasn't principle, it's prudence somewhere else. And so I'm sure that all of us, as we're engaged in this conversation, that he'll continue to clarify and write more stuff. But I will say in this particular article, I had a lot of moments where I wasn't quite sure what his stance was.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's fair. John, any thoughts thus far?
Yeah, no, what James just brought up, I think is important. It's kind of like, well, this would never work. How's this going to work? And I think there's a part of the conversation here is just the broader like idealism versus pragmatism. And I think a large swath of the Christian nationalist conversation is just idealism. All right. Posting, video clips of crusaders come in and, even all the posting from, Department of Defense and stuff in America. It's not, it's kind of fantasy world. But then I do think that there is, that's not actually what people are only taking, right? If it's not the ideal, then it's nothing. I think people are happy to see movement, practical steps happening, but they don't lose their ideal or continue to dream about the ideals. And so, how does this work out? Well, we'll figure that out. That's kind of how Josh started.
Well, and that's
you know,
that to me is part of, there's been a lot of back and forth over what role pastors versus theologians versus political scientists should have on, like, who gets to speak to these issues, and are they inherently theological or political? And I'm one that's very happy to stay in my lane when I need to. But I think one of the concerning things with this is, if you were to look at any aspect, for example, of church life, just to bring it, down to the lay level, when you look at people, and I preach on a Sunday morning, even as I hear those admonishments and encouragements, applying to myself, even as it does to our people, you're reminded of the fact that you need to know where you're headed. I am not as I will be, but I'm not where I was. The important part in that whole process is there's a goal in mind. This is the same thing as in church work. You need to, I think it's healthy, and I've grown to appreciate 3, 5, 7-year visions for your church. That's not you saying, like, we're going to, prognosticate the future. It's just saying, like, we have some goals. Those might need tweaking along the way. We might not like the way we try to get to some of those, but in general, here's where we see ourselves headed. That helps form and shape you where you are. This is what I see from this discussion is a reticence a lot of times, and I'm not laying this at the feet of Kevin DeYoung, because I think his article is actually a little bit of the opposite. I see a reticence oftentimes in these discussions of people to say we should even think of what it could be, because there is a myopia when it comes to just the myopic view that says, here's where we are and nothing can change. And what concerned me a little bit in this article was, the article says toward the concluding part, his concluding objection was essentially, we cannot get this done right now. We're not in a spot to do these things. Also, the world is going to think you're repugnant because of the way these are being introduced. And oftentimes along the route of, John, what you said, right? People are getting online and LARPing and tweeting things that are just, the meat of Twitter is just kind of in that realm. But I think what that can miss, and this would just be, again, this is conciliatory, brotherly sort of discussion. I fear that helps that can lead us into missing what we should be aiming for in the process. I understand. You look around, and we're in the I guess you could qualify this as the Northeast, where we are, whatever Western PA is. But we're not in a spot to enact a lot of the things that I think would be God honoring and would be godly. But I still want to teach my children and my children's children, this is what God would have of you. If you find yourself in Babylon, pray and plant trees and labor hard, but do it with a vision as to, this is what would honor God, and I'm going to take advantage of walking that way every chance I get to. Every vote I can cast, every policy I might be able to speak to, whatever way I might be able to do these things, I want to move toward that goal and ideal. That's what I fear is oftentimes missed in this conversation. I don't want social upheaval tomorrow. I would like for Christians to have a very clear eye toward, this is what would honor God in a society.
I think the other thing I would add, and it's a little pushback to John, is or it's complimentary, I'll say that. Things change fast. Things can change really fast. I mean, stuff that we might think is impossible, it's insane to gain that much ground, so don't turn people off by mentioning it. Not that Kevin's necessarily saying that. But some people do. And it underestimates just how quickly societies can shift at these big inflection moments. And we all feel the tension in America right now. We all feel that there is a lot of tectonic shifts happening. And I think it's a responsibility of Christians to step up in those moments and paint a positive vision of how we could look better on the other side of that, not worse. Yeah. Particularly at a local level. Like, I'm big on folks focusing on local. Do you guys want to talk First Amendment? I have thoughts.
Go ahead.
Let's talk First Amendment. I know a couple of the things I wanted to talk about: definition of nation. I wanted to talk about the exercise of piety from the confession. Mm-hmm. Let's jump in. Yeah, go ahead and lead us into the First Amendment.
Okay, let me turn off my notifications. I'm the worst co-host ever. All right, First Amendment. So this factors in a big piece of DeYoung's article, and one of his questions is, do you think the First Amendment is a mistake? And my response to that would be, well, which version of the First Amendment? Is this the one from the original Bill of Rights? Is this, or is this more about how the First Amendment gets incorporated in the, mostly in the 20th century? The difference is, originally when it was written, the First Amendment was restricting Congress, right? The first word is Congress shall make no law. And there's two parts to the religious aspects of the First Amendment. There's the Congress can't make a law establishing, a religion for the federal government, and Congress can't make any laws that prohibit the free exercise of religion. Well, originally written, both of those were laws about Congress. Now, in the 20th century, the Supreme Court starts deciding this binds the states as well. So, which version of the First Amendment are we talking about? Now, the response to that could be, well, granted, the First Amendment, properly speaking, originally only constrained the federal government, but many states today have, let's say, free exercise clauses, right, where people can practice their religion. So, okay, First Amendment doesn't do it, but the state constitutions do. And there's two responses to that. I think the first one is, well, if I live in Florida, if Florida wanted to change people voted to change the Constitution to remove their free exercise statements, that would be fine. It would not be unconstitutional, right? Wouldn't be a problem with the First Amendment. So I think the First Amendment is a bit of a red herring in that respect. The second thing that I'd want to say is that the free exercise clauses were never absolute. So it never gave you the freedom to practice religion however you would like. The best example I think about that is the blasphemy laws that you have. Like almost all the states have blasphemy laws for a very long time. Many states today still have them, or a couple still have them on the books. And I want to read one blasphemy law from New Jersey. So here it is. And be it enacted by the authority aforesaid that if any person shall willfully blaspheme the holy name of God by denying, cursing, contumeliously reproaching his being or providence, or by cursing and contumeliously reproaching Jesus Christ or the Holy Ghost or the Christian religion or the holy word of God, that is, the canonical scriptures contained in the books of the Old and New Testament, or by profanely scoffing at or exposing them or any of them to contempt and ridicule, then every person so offending shall, on conviction, be punished by a fine not exceeding $200. That's a lot of money, 1796. Or an imprisonment at hard labor, not exceeding 12 months, or both, at the discretion of the court.
Wow.
This was while the Constitution of New Jersey also had this clause, that no person shall ever within this colony be deprived of the inestimable privilege of worshiping God Almighty in a manner agreeable to the dictates of his own conscience. So who does that exclude? Muslims. If you have someone who's preaching the Quran, right, they're going to tell you Jesus isn't God, right? New Testament is a fake. They are worshiping God Almighty in a manner agreeable to the dictates of their own conscience, and yet they're transgressing a blasphemy law. And this was considered perfectly acceptable at the time because free exercise was not absolute. It didn't give you total rights. In fact, you can go back and read a Supreme Court justice like Joseph Story when he's talking about the First Amendment. And what he says is the point of the First Amendment was to stop Christian sects, like different denominations, from warring with each other. And he says it was not intended to prostrate Christianity before Islam, Judaism, or atheism. So my point being is that the First Amendment is not a silver bullet. And DeYoung says in his article, he says, he asked the question, which historic version of America do you want to go back to? And he says, I want to go back to the founding. I'd say your terms are acceptable. Let's go back to the founding. Let's have blasphemy laws, Sabbath laws, a constrained understanding of the free exercise clause, whether it's in the First Amendment or in the state constitutions. And the basic idea here is that this isn't un-American. The state constitutions were not a mistake if we have an originalist understanding of what they're originally intended to mean.
So one of the things that came to my mind when you were talking about that is the article points out, and I'm trying to remember the exact section, but it talks about some of the modern innovations of the 20th century. Essentially, it's laying and help me out here if you can remember the exact verbiage, but essentially it was making the contention that some of the proponents of Christian nationalism are products of 20th century post-Enlightenment kind of
Right.
liberal thinking that seeped into our common discourse. And again, if I'm misphrasing any of that, forgive me, because I don't have it in front of me. However, what's interesting to me is when you talk about things, specifically when it comes to like the First Amendment and some of these issues and religious freedom versus things like religious liberty, a lot of the religious equality, a lot of these terms get thrown around synonymously, and yet they're very distinct. And a lot of these terms come out of the 1960s and the legal legislation that came through later, which is in essence redefined specifically when it comes to the First Amendment, has done a lot of spade work with the First Amendment as its tool to redefine those words in a way that we come to a place today. And this is where I think it's important for the Christian. And this is where I think we have common ground with the article. The article was pointing out that it is a judgment on any land when they sin against God, that God actually does look upon nations as such, with all the qualifications, and we can get into some of the definitional kind of interludes about what a nation is. However, the article recognized that nations
People
do
group.
actually. I'm sorry.
A people group, like just, yeah.
People group would be fine. I had. I'll make this point, and then we can get back to that. This is the whole point I was trying to make, and this to me was one of the largest things that the article kind of raised this question for me. The article recognized that God does in fact judge nations. I think that's thoroughly biblically established. Old and New Testament makes no difference. We see that throughout Scripture. So God judges nations when they sin against him. And it doesn't have to be a majority sinning against him. It can be a minority that the majority simply approves of or acquiesces to or is conciliatory with. Israel knows that there's, half their folks are over there worshiping an idol. They're not doing it, but they're still letting them do it and making room for them to do it. God looks on that and says, no, I'm going to judge you as a people. It's a corporate idea. It's a covenantal idea. This is something that we as Presbyterians are very comfortable with, is thinking in corporate terms.
Wait. People are worried about the covenant term to modern nations. So just say it's a federal idea.
Thank you. Your critique is well received, James. So this idea of a people group being judged, it did. I don't think the article made any mention of being blessed, but that's beside the point because we are dealing with being judged here. The question is if a people group is being judged based on sin and idolatry, let's even say rejection of God, would we not want our magistrates and every other sphere of our society to lead our society in such a way as to not incur the wrath and judgment of God by acquiescing to or even actively supporting grounds for idolatry and breaching of the law? That to me, again, this is the cart before the horse. If God looks on nations and judges them, with whatever our political theology looks like and whatever size or scope you want your government to have, I'm here for those conversations. However, can we not first start with the fact of if we are allowing idolatry to fester within our nation, that doesn't get us out of it because we're still working out our political theology. God still judges nations based on that. Does that not seem like a fair question?
I think it is. And the two people I immediately think of are Samuel Stanhope Smith and Ashbel Green. So you have John Witherspoon's the president of Princeton, then Smith, and then Green. And Smith and Green both write these essays about how God judges nations based upon whether or not they follow the law of God. So this is a very American Presbyterian idea. I mean, these guys are alive at the founding. Stanhope Smith was part of the revisions committee. Ashbel Green was young, but he was still listening to the debates. So this is very consistent with our American version of the confession that God does judge nations. Now, I think a lot of people, when they hear that, they're worried that what you're saying is go out and commit everyone to the ban. Every single idolater needs to be immediately killed. That is not the way in which God judges nations today. Here's how he judges nations today. He will go up to the magistrate and he will say, I gave you some talents. Did you invest them or did you bury them? Did you try to promote true religion and suppress false religion? That's what I'm looking for. And I think with that parable, if the tenant had come back and said, I tried, I was a horrible investor, God would have been like, but you tried, right? The person who gets cast into hell at the end of the story is the one who buried it. And so we shouldn't purity spiral, right? God is looking for a positive march in the right direction with the best effort we can give. and while being wise and prudent and sensitive to local circumstances, you know.
Yeah. And I think the article, because again, I want to be conciliatory to the article that was written
Yes.
because
Yep.
there's so much to agree with that I found in there.
Yep.
But some of the parts that I just still find confusing, which I suppose is why we're having this ongoing conversation, is, for example, this was when the article was talking about the First Amendment and religious freedom.
Hmm.
This is what was said, and I'm quoting. It said, nations are right to want to preserve a sense of national identity and to insist that newcomers embrace something of their nation's story and tradition, end
Hmm.
quote. And when I was reading that, I thought to myself, like, yes, such as the Christian faith.
Exactly. Yeah, I
Because
thought
again,
the same thing.
this is not even trying to establish some sort of hardline establishmentarianism at this point. This is just saying, like, do we not all recognize, as I think the article even sort of recognizes, that we have a Christian heritage that absolutely formed the identity and cultural ethos of our nation. Therefore, if that statement is true, and we are right, in fact, to ask for a preservation of our national identity and to insist that newcomers embrace something akin to it, that seems like a promulgation of the Christian faith. That seems in
Yeah.
line with the magistrate promoting the true religion.
So on some of these points, I'm still meditating to discern DeYoung's position. But I think that to be fair to him, I think his rejoinder to you would be that he does want to keep the customs, the manners, the habits that are Christian. You know, at one point he talks about how we should have Christian symbols in different government
That's right.
events.
Yeah.
Right. And he says explicitly, I want, magistrates to be regular churchgoers, credible profession of faith. They speak warmly of Christ, adorn gospel behavior. Those are all the things he wants. It seems that what he opposes is any of that happening through formal government action. I think that's his position,
And I think
especially legally.
right, and I think you're probably right. Which again, I think we are getting to. It's starting to become the horse in front of the cart at that point because
Mm,
I think most of his objections were to how the magistrate was to do that. But I
right.
think you're right as far as the engagement. Here's my issue. Among other places, when the article was quoting from the confession, chapter 23, subsection 3, and it just notes, and the article affirms that the magistrate ought to maintain piety, justice, and peace. That's difficult for me to reckon with. If you're affirming the magistrate's responsibility before God to maintain piety, how are you to do that without some form or fashion of that magistrate promulgating the true faith, not knowingly promulgating the true
Right.
faith?
That's
I
right.
don't know how those two things walk hand in hand without the magistrate, even if it's a very truncated, small, limited role, promulgating the true faith.
I agree. And this, I would say, I think if I was going to pick one thing that I straightforwardly disagree with, not in a unbrotherly way, but I just take the opposite position. It would be the line where he says this, I do not want government to direct its citizens to the highest heavenly good or to order society around true religion, because I do not trust the government to determine true religion from false religion, and I do not trust human beings to wield this kind of authority well or wisely. Um, and so it's hard for me to tell if that's principled or prudent. But so you have a person who he says, I want our magistrates to be a regular churchgoer, have a credible profession of faith, to speak warmly of Christ. These are government magistrates with official positions. But as soon as they start acting in their official positions, he says they're no longer competent to determine what the true religion is. I don't know how those two things fit together. If they were competent enough to get to heaven, to be counted as a son of God, to be, to inherit the new creation
One,
by
it's
the Holy Spirit. They're competent enough for that. They're not competent enough to say we're going to close businesses on Sunday because it's
and
the Lord's Day.
And I think it's
I
interesting, if
Go
if
ahead.
you've worked within, I'm sorry, I walked on top of you there, James, but yeah, if you've worked within like the
All's
criminal,
forgiven.
yeah, thank you. If you've worked within like the criminal justice system, you understand how
Mhm.
like these matters aren't typically the magistrate coming in and saying whether supralapsarianism is correct. It's usually those very bare bones, we are regularly horrified in the news, or at least I am, by just absolutely egregious mismanagements of justice by magistrates who have no sense of right or wrong, no sense of godly punishment, letting people who should in some form or fashion be punished for their crimes instead letting them roam free, and us reading the results of those actions. So this isn't something that's like relegated to a magistrate calling synods or councils. This is also very meat and potatoes of our system. Here's what I want to jump into, and then James, I'm going to cede way to you because I walked on top of you. But this was one thing I thought of when he was talking about nations, because again, we probably don't have time to walk through nations as persons and those discussions. But he cited Dabney. Now I thought Dabney, since he's on the table from this article, Dabney's definition of government, although he defines it in a couple of places, but he defines civil government in one of the more concise definitions was it is simply the protection of temporal rights against aggression, foreign and domestic, which I think is a good kind of truncated version. I think we could also add quite well, and Dabney does as well. If we kept reading, he adds the responsibilities of Romans 13. They are to reward what is good and punish what is evil. That's pretty standard. What I wanted to push in on was Althusius. When Althusius talks about this, he talks about the state, and he's talking about the state's responsibility to promote social life. It's something that he refers to as symbiotics, which is just simply the art of living together. The state is supposed to, whether you think they should do a lot or a little, again, that's the horse. But he says the state is to kind of encourage this social life, these symbiotics. And then he goes on to say that the family is that most natural of human associations from which those other associations grow, which is sort of where I keyed in on that. But if you're to take that conception, that Althusian conception of symbiotics, the state kind of promulgating these, this is what's interesting to me is when I read toward the conclusion of the article, it says, quote, I believe rectification happens by strong, and he's talking about rectification of society, the social order. He says it happens by strong churches, by strong families, by strong institutions, by adorning the gospel with good deeds, and by defending our constitutionally protected freedoms. And to that I say yes and amen. He says, what I don't think it entails is calling upon the government to make irreligion and non-Christian religions impermissible. And therein, to me, was part of this whole rub that we're trying to identify, is that if you're saying that the government is there to promote the symbiosis of its people, that includes promotion of the true religion to facilitate all of those good and godly things that you've just laid out. I agree with those ends. There's a means through which we are to get there, and I think the government is tasked with that responsibility, be it small or little in its jurisdiction. It is to promote that true religion, that those things might in fact flourish, because we can look at the papers and you can see example after example of governments who make no such goal, and Christianity is repressed in those places currently within our world.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
I think that makes total sense. I have two responses to the same thing because I think DeYoung raises the great question of, what's the point of civil government? And he kind of argues that the civil government should not have anything to do with our highest end, only local temporal ends like civil welfare, property, life. Now, there's an interesting essay that's written around the time of Dabney by a Northern Presbyterian named Joshua McIlvaine. And the name of the essay is A Nation's Right to Worship God. And so he's saying, yes, it is the job of the government to protect the rights of its citizens. And one right that a citizenry has as a body politic is to determine in their civil life how God will be worshiped and honored. And he's arguing for civil Sabbath laws for public schools to teach Protestantism to students. And he's saying these two things are not incompatible. That's the first thing I would say. It's a great essay. You should go read it. The other thing that I would say is let's assume, I do not think that our temporal well-being and our spiritual well-being are that easy to untangle at all. And this is just true statistically. There's been a ton of research done comparing Christian societies versus non-Christian societies. And you can do this, for example. Like in India, you go to the regions that were reached by missionaries, and you go to the regions that maintained Hinduism or their local religion, and you compare you compare the weight of female babies. Guess what you're going to find out? Way healthier in Christian regions. Why? Women are made in the image of God. And that's not something that is valued in the same way in Hinduism.
Hmm.
So there's tons of this research, and I put together a whole list of multivariable, very large sample size studies. In fact, all of the research together looked at 1.5 million people. And here's what they found. They found that society, the Christian society, it's correlated with stronger economies, better education, better healthcare, more care for others, more generosity, more environmental care, more democratic values, less delinquency, less crime, less violence, less corruption, and much more. So let's say that the government is only responsible for those temporal things, the well-being. Should it positively promote Christianity? Should it try and make Christianity flourish and non-Christianity try and keep it from gaining a foothold? Yes. Yes, it should.
John, you were like a gargoyle on the chat today. Thoughts?
Yeah, so you guys started out by denouncing Christian nationalism. You don't identify, and you know, your modern self expression. And same thing with Kevin DeYoung. And I think that's part of this article, and it's part of why I think it's important to talk about it. I think part of this article is conciliatory, like you guys have been saying. Here's where I kind of agree and where the overlap is, but I'm not there. I can't actually sign off onto this thing. But I think that's kind of a fool's errand, because labels like this aren't ones that you self-identify. It's not your pronouns in your bio. Now, people do that. People got all sorts of Christian nationalist pronouns on their Twitter profiles. But this is a broader reality that if anybody outside of this niche conversation were to read what Kevin DeYoung believes, that's 100% Christian nationalism. MSNBC would destroy him. The View, you would think he's the worst person in the whole world. Charlie Kirk never called himself a Christian nationalist, but he's been called a Christian nationalist millions of times, I'm sure,
right.
In the broader culture. And so I think there's a little bit of like this, I'm creating not only a conciliatory, but also space. I don't want to identify with, and I have in mind particular people. He names a couple of them in his article. Well, I don't agree with Stephen Wolfe, so I'm not a Christian nationalist. I don't agree with Doug Wilson, so I'm not, I don't agree with whoever. Choose the guy who's muddied the waters too much for you to be part of the pot. But I think about this broader movement. I'm not as historically attuned as you guys are on American founding, but I think of what is the environment in which this is really kind of coming from. And I think what really falls flat for me on an article like this is it's kind of I'm going to redraw the lines in a way that, if they can answer these things right, then maybe I'll play or something like that. And it doesn't give a positive vision. I don't think the idea of being conservative is appealing to anybody anymore, because there's nothing left to conserve. We don't want to just hold on to the status quo. People criticize even Christian nationalists for liking Trump. Like MAGA isn't the thing we're trying to conserve or whatever. And there's this reality that we've gone so far down in the secular pluralism of our day that this work of retrieval is what's driving this. Reformation needs to happen. We're not just trying to hold on, buckets of water out of the ship. Like the ship sank 100 years ago, 50 years ago, whatever. And so it's retrieving back even what DeYoung's saying. Well, let's go back to the founding. That's not conservatism. That's a whole nother project. And that, I think, is the broader Christian nationalist conversation, is to say, whatever we've been doing for a long time has failed us. Where did we go wrong? How do we get back? Now, for some, that might be American founding. For some, it's Westminster establishmentarianism. For others, it's Crusades, whatever. There's all these different conversations. But what this article, in my opinion, doesn't do is it doesn't provide a positive vision. And that's what people really are gravitating towards with Christian nationalism. Yeah, the memeing is great and funny, but it actually gives hope and vision for what potentially could be. And so like the PCA did this in the 80s. They had a study committee on church and state, and it went through, education and just all these different dynamics of society. And what does it look like for, faithful Christian participation in these things? It's a fantastic report. I didn't know it existed until like 3 months ago. I don't know what the study committee is going to do with Christian nationalism, but I don't think it's going to be that. I don't think it's going to be, here's a positive vision. I think the right move, a better move, maybe not the right move, a better move for Kevin DeYoung is not to say, well, I'm going to hold this out, arm's length away. Here's where I can agree. Is actually to say, well, if you guys want to do Christian nationalism, here's what it should look like. Here's the way forward. Yeah. Okay. There's excesses over here, over there. Guess what? There's going to be all sorts of people that have different motivations and different loyalties in any movement. But to say, no, here's the principles that we're building on, right? The James's book is just one principle. It's a foundational principle. Okay. So now we can build on that. And it's creating this foundation and longer term building block for what could be and how we get there. And so the kind of like naysaying or denounce the thing or, to me, it's missing what is driving this movement more broadly. I think everybody and any stripe of Reformed, even just broadly Protestant, would probably fall somewhere on this spectrum of Christian nationalists in terms of desiring more Christian influence in society and more just laws and those kind of things. But the bigger question is what we've been doing has failed us. So what ought we to do instead?
I think that's great. I think of I had to look it up because I couldn't remember the second guy's name, but it's the classic case of Odysseus, right, versus Orpheus. That's how you say it, right? So what does one do? All his guys, right, put beeswax in their ears. He ties himself to the mast so he can hear the sirens, right? I think that's what a lot of guys are doing right now. They're kind of saying, be quiet and eat your Brussels sprouts, right? Orpheus, what does he do? He plays more beautiful music, right? And that allows everyone to be delighted on the ship, right? And there's zero risk. And so I think so many young guys are saying, we see problems with our own two eyes. We're getting sick from eating so much. We have no protein. We've only had Brussels sprouts. We need, and come out and give them a big, fat, juicy steak and take them under your wing, paint a positive vision, and they'll follow you. Raise your banner and they will follow you. And then you'll actually be able to save people from excesses because they trust you. If all that you're doing is sending people to the principal's office, what happens? They're going to rebel. They're going to rebel. If you have a troublesome teenager, you don't want him going to the principal's office. You want him going to the football coach, right? And we're getting a whole lot of principal's office, and we need some football coach because otherwise we are going to have barbarians at the gates.
John, I think it's really good what you said about the positive vision forward. And that is something that, by the way, I don't think any of the three of us, I don't think I'm assuming that to myself. I would love to hear elder statesmen, Kevin DeYoung with this article, whoever it might be, capable men, lead forward with that positive vision. If you can establish, I know I'm at risk of overplaying an illustration, but just that analogy of the cart before the horse, if we were to establish those kind of first principles, let's just say we affirm Proverbs 14, that righteousness exalts a people, but sin is a reproach upon any people. Right, righteousness exalts a nation, but that sin is a reproach upon any people. That's what our first principle. We recognize that the worship of false gods is a reproach upon any people. And then we seek in every aspect of our society, our symbiosis, to promote the true religion and to not exalt something that God says he judges. If we can just start with those basic principles, lead me with a vision forward. And then we can have some disagreement on the steps, but at least then we can have a unified front to address. And I do think it's the young people. I don't think it's just the young people. I know a lot of battle-weary, middle to late aged Christians who see a world in which churches are actively funding and advocating for mosques to be built, and they simply don't even know what category to put things in. They have no frame of reference for, wait a minute, is this not the thing we just preached from Joshua on Sunday? Didn't we say that this was a bad thing, but now we're supporting it? Let's just start with those first principles. Righteousness exalts a nation, sin is a reproach upon any people. Every facet of our society should reflect the true faith and promote it. And then we could talk about the details and how far that should go.
Amen. Hey, here's a principle. I wrote this. Here's what I think we should do. Here's what we should believe. We should say that Christians should advocate for prudent constitutional measures to legally promote Christianity, suppress false religion in a way that's factoring for local circumstance. That's what I think we should do. One sentence.
It's pretty good. Closing thoughts, gentlemen. I do want to recommend again the article with 6 questions for Christian nationalists. Kevin DeYoung authored this December 1st publishing date. It was through Clearly Reformed. It's a good read. I encourage you to read it. You'll find much to agree with, I suspect. You may also find some to push back on, as we have, in brotherly affection and a desire to forge a path forward. But any closing thoughts as we wrap this one up?
Nope, I'm good.
All right. Well, if you got questions, we do want to continue to be a service to those who come to the channel. So if you have mean things to say about the episode, you can keep those to yourself. But if you have any pushback or maybe even anything that you feel like we've left a stone unturned, we're open to that. We have an email address. I don't know what it is. Do you guys know what it is?
covenantmattersem@gmail.com.
Is it really? Look at you. Thank you, John. Covenant Matters. I knew that the whole time. I was just testing John. covenantmattersem@gmail.com, or reach out through socials. We're on there as well. But yeah, I hope this has been helpful and look forward to talking to you guys again. So James, John, thank you guys.
The Steadfast Legacy Sumatra is a bold cigar with a nice balance of spice, leather, and dried fruit. You can find these and all our other premium cigars at steadfastcigars.com. Use promo code Covenant10 for 10% off your order. Remain steadfast and hold the line.